Here with Army Group A. Only 30% are further north with Army Group B, where the Allies think the main thrust will be. Over 60 years later, Tommy Franks and his planners face an apparently even more challenging situation. The first problem is distance. Baghdad lies 350 miles north of Kuwait, the start point for Iraqi freedom. The second is topography. Iraq is dominated by two major rivers, the Euphrates to the west and the Tigris to the east. Where these come together about 100 miles from the sea, there is an area of marshland. This is impassable to tanks. This topography and the road system creates what the military call choke points, places like river crossings, towards which advancing forces are inevitably funneled, and where they can be attacked from prepared positions. The Americans know this, but so do the Iraqis, and on paper at least, the figures seem to be on their side. Despite more than a decade of UN sanctions, Iraq still has an apparently formidable army of 375,000 men with more than 2,000 tanks. And Saddam Hussein can also call on a substantial number of irregulars, both dedicated followers of his Ba'ath Party and the Fedayeen, Muslim fanatics from all over the Arab world who have flocked to Iraq to fight the infidel crusaders. To get around this, Tommy Franks, just like the German planners 60 years before, allows his enemy and many Western journalists and military commentators to think that he is going for a completely different plan. Fresh in their minds is Operation Desert Storm, the war mounted just a decade earlier against Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. After an air campaign lasting 6 weeks and a land campaign of just 4 days, Saddam's forces were pushed out of Kuwait. Because of the distance to the main objective, Baghdad, Iraqi planners and many Western military pundits expect Franks to follow the same battle plan as Desert Storm. A prolonged aerial campaign before a land assault. And his staff do everything to encourage this.
In time-honored fashion, prior to the launching of Operation Iraqi Freedom, certain information, certain parts of the plan was actually leaked to certain individuals and organisations in the hope, and indeed the expectation, that it would get back to the Iraqi High Command and they would begin to plan on the pretext of that false information that they had actually received.
Also, Franks had originally intended to mount a second assault into northern Iraq from Turkey. The U.S. 4th Mechanized Infantry Division had been sent there by sea. But local opposition forces Turkey's government to refuse permission for the 4th Infantry to cross the country. The U.S. ships are reloaded and set sail for the Suez Canal and Kuwait.
Although deception plans have to be very carefully planned and programmed, there is of course always the opportunity to use events as they unfold to bamboozle the enemy. And a very good example of that is of course the coalition trying to move through Turkey.
Most commentators, and almost certainly the Iraqi planners, expect Franks to wait for the 4th Infantry to arrive before he attacks. This is exactly what he wants them to believe, but it isn't what he plans to do.
This is a very good example of how armies can use an unexpected opportunity to deceive the enemy. Because whilst the Iraqis are actually thinking that the Americans would have to come south and to relocate and reorganize themselves prior to the attack taking place in the south, all of the time the Allies are moving lighter troops to try and actually give them the edge that they need to launch an attack before the Iraqis can possibly think that they are ready.
So, on the brink of battle, both groups of battle planners have successfully fulfilled the first requirement of Blitzkrieg, to deceive the enemy as to their intentions. In May 1940, the Allies are totally expecting an attack into the Low Countries and have based all their battle plans on this. They do not even consider the possibility of an attack through the Ardennes. In March 2003, the Iraqis and many Western commentators are totally expecting a lengthy air campaign, while coalition forces are built up steadily to achieve overwhelming numerical superiority over the Iraqis. Then a massive invasion was anticipated, not a surgical strike. The second requirement for a successful Blitzkrieg battle plan is to control the air. In 1940 and 2003, both the German and American battle planners have a clear advantage. They dominate the skies. In May 1940, the German Luftwaffe was a formidable force, with more than 1,700 bombers against less than 400, and 1,000 modern fighters against just over 800 for the French and British. The Luftwaffe had been built up from scratch in less than 5 years, and no expense had been spared. All its equipment was new. Its pilots elite. It had been designed specifically to support the sort of Blitzkrieg battle plan which Germany's leaders were intending to fight. In contrast, both the French and British air forces had been starved of funds until the mid-1930s and were caught in the middle of rapid expansion programs which were far from complete. Almost all the Luftwaffe's fighters were the Messerschmitt Bf 109, one of the most advanced and formidable fighting machines of the time. Almost 1,000 were already in service. It could only be rivaled by one Allied fighter, the British Supermarine Spitfire, and in spring 1940, less than 100 of these were available. The German Air Force also had 342 of the terrifying Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, which had been specifically designed for pinpoint attacks in support of a Blitzkrieg battle plan. The Allies had no comparable ground attack aircraft. In March 2003, the coalition also completely outnumbered and outclassed the Iraqi Air Force. The full might of the U.S. Air Force and Marine Corps and Navy aviation, with more than 3,000 ultra-modern fighters and fighter bombers, and 1,500 bombers and specialized ground attack aircraft, faced a handful of former Soviet fighters which had not received any spare parts for 10 years and were barely able to fly. The Iraqis did have some ex-Soviet anti-aircraft missile units and gun batteries. But 10 years of U.S. and British aircraft imposing the United Nations no-fly zones had destroyed most of the radar systems on which these depended. On paper, at least, control the air was the only Blitzkrieg requirement in which either the German battle planners of 1940 or the U.S. battle planners of 2003 seemed to have a clear advantage. As far as being able to break through by achieving overwhelming force, both the Germans and the Americans seemed totally outnumbered. In both May 1940 and March 2003, appearances were deceptive. Next, the third vital requirement of Blitzkrieg: to break through by concentrating overwhelming force. Here, both teams of Blitzkrieg battle planners did have a clear advantage, but an advantage which was only clear after the event. In May 1940, not only were the Germans outnumbered in every other area than the air, but their tanks had thinner armor and less powerful guns than those of the Allies. The vast majority were light tanks, Panzer Mark I's originally intended for training and carrying only 2 machine guns, or Mark II's, designed as a reconnaissance vehicle armed with a 20mm cannon. Both should be easy meat for the many Allied tanks armed with 37mm and 40mm weapons, capable of slicing through their thin armor. The few medium tanks in the Panzer divisions, Mark III's with a 37mm gun and Mark IV's with a short-barreled 75, were also outclassed by many Allied tanks, particularly the mighty French Char B, which carried both a 47 and a 75mm gun. But the German battle planners were able to concentrate the majority of their crucial panzer divisions opposite the one sector of the front which the Allies thought hardly worth covering, the Ardennes. And these panzer divisions had been specially designed as fast-moving mechanized formations with a balance of tanks and motorized artillery and infantry, and trained to exploit an initial breakthrough ruthlessly. The German deception plan meant that the best Allied divisions had moved forward into Belgium, leaving the vital sector opposite the Ardennes defended by a few divisions of overage reservists. In the area where their battle plan required overwhelming force to break through the enemy line, the Germans had more than achieved it. In contrast, in March 2003, Tommy Franks never intended to achieve numerical superiority on the ground. 10 years earlier, in Operation Desert Storm, the Allies had fielded 750,000 men and over 2,000 tanks. As March 2003 began, the coalition had barely 120,000 men against the theoretical Iraqi strength of 375,000 and barely 500 tanks.